The moment Edna Collins stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, the summer of 1878, she knew with bone-deep certainty that the life she had buried back in Missouri was never going to find her here, and that suited her just fine. Dust rose around her boots like a living thing, coating the hem of her blue calico dress, stinging her eyes in the fierce July heat. The town spread out before her in the way most frontier towns did, raw and unpolished, a collection of weathered timber buildings leaning into each other for support, a water trough running along the main street, where a pair of spotted horses stood with their great heads drooping in the afternoon sun. A sign above the general store read Harmon's Goods and Provisions, the letters barely legible beneath years of wind and grit. Somewhere down the street, a piano was playing, not well but persistently. Redemption Creek was alive in its rough, ungraceful way, and Edna breathed it in. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, with steady brown eyes that had seen more than they should have for her age. She carried one trunk and one smaller bag, everything she owned in the world after 2 years of watching her mother decline, and then passing, after selling the small house in Hannibal where she had grown up, after deciding that staying in a place where every corner held a ghost was no way to live a life. She had answered an advertisement in the Missouri Weekly Gazette placed by a cattleman in Redemption Creek seeking a housekeeper and cook. The advertisement had been plain and businesslike, and she had written back in the same manner. The arrangement was professional, she had told herself repeatedly on the 3-day journey south and west. It was work. It was a fresh beginning. What the advertisement had not told her was anything meaningful about Harvey Carson. The man who came to meet the stagecoach was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from years of actual labor rather than vanity, wearing a dark hat pulled low over a face that was angular and sun-bronzed, and currently wearing an expression of mild surprise, as though the stagecoach had delivered something he had not entirely expected. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar, and eyes the particular shade of gray-green that reminded Edna, immediately and without her permission, of still water under a cloudy sky. His clothes were clean but working clothes, canvas trousers, a worn linen shirt, boots that had seen 10,000 miles of Texas ground. He held his hat in his hands and turned it once, twice, in a gesture that Edna would come to recognize as the thing Harvey Carson did when he was uncertain. "Miss Collins," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the kind of voice that did not waste itself. "Mr. Carson," she said, and put out her hand the way her mother had always taught her, firmly and without hesitation. He looked at the extended hand for just a moment longer than was strictly polite, then shook it. His grip was warm and brief, and he released her hand as though it had surprised him. "I'll get your trunk," he said. "I can manage the bag," she told him. He nodded once, as though that had been exactly the correct answer, and hefted her trunk onto his shoulder with the casual ease of a man accustomed to carrying heavy things. The Carson Ranch sat 4 miles outside of Redemption Creek proper, at the end of a rutted track that wound through mesquite and scrub oak, and finally opened onto a broad flat, where a solid 2-story ranch house stood surrounded by a working spread barn, bunkhouse, chicken yard, vegetable garden, the whole enterprise enclosed by split-rail fencing that disappeared into the distance where the cattle grazed. It was not grand, but it was real and it was well tended, and Edna felt something loosen in her chest when she saw it. Harvey explained the arrangement during the drive out in his buckboard, speaking in that measured way of his, looking mostly at the horse's ears. He had 2 ranch hands, brothers named Cleet and Darnell Hobb, who kept to the bunkhouse. The house had 6 rooms. Her room would be the back bedroom on the ground floor with its own door to the kitchen. Meals were at 6, noon, and 6. He kept his own accounts. He had a dog named Sergeant who would not trouble her once he was accustomed to her scent. He did not drink to excess, and he expected the same courtesy of those in his household. Edna listened, watched him, and said, "That all seems reasonable." He glanced at her then briefly, as though reassessing something. What he had not said, and what Edna pieced together over the first several days, was this. Harvey Carson had been alone for a long time. He had inherited the ranch at 26 when his father died and his mother returned to her family in San Antonio. He had built the herd up from 40 head to nearly 200 over the following 7 years with nothing but will and work. He had no wife, had never been engaged, had not, as far as anyone in Redemption Creek could tell, ever seriously pursued a woman. He was not cold. He was simply quiet in a way that ran all the way down to the foundation of him, and most people did not know what to do with that. Edna, who had grown up with a quiet mother and had spent much of her adult life in the comfortable company of her own thoughts, found his quietness not threatening but oddly restful. She settled into the house with the efficiency that had always been her great practical talent. The kitchen was in reasonable order and she improved it. She found where things were kept, reorganized the pantry, made a list of what was needed from Harmon's store, and presented it to Harvey on her second morning with the confidence of a woman who has never had any patience for hesitation. He looked at the list, pulled a fold of bills from his shirt pocket, and handed it over without comment. Then he went out to saddle his horse and spent the day with the cattle, and she spent the day making the house smell like something worth coming home to. She cooked well. This was not vanity, simply fact. Edna had learned from her mother, who had learned from her mother before her, and the result was that the first dinner she set on Harvey Carson's table, roasted chicken with corn bread, and a pot of stewed tomatoes, and a dried apple pie that she had assembled from the contents of his modest pantry, produced in Harvey Carson the longest continuous sentence she had yet heard from him. He ate quietly, as she had expected, cleaning his plate with the focused appreciation of a man who had been eating his own indifferent cooking for too long. Then he set down his fork, looked at the pie, and said, "Miss Collins, I want you to know that I wrote to 3 women who answered that advertisement before you, and 2 of them never responded to my letters. And the 3rd came out on the stage in April, took 1 look at the place, got back on the same stage, and was gone inside of an hour. And I had about decided that I was going to be eating my own cooking until the end of my natural life, and I am very glad tonight that I was wrong." He said all of this to the table, not quite to her, and when he finally looked up there was something in his expression that was not quite embarrassment and not quite relief, but existed somewhere between the two. Edna looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The pie could be better. The apple was dried a bit long. I'll do better once I can get fresh fruit." He stared at her. Then he laughed, and it was a sudden genuine sound that transformed his whole face, and Edna felt something shift in the room between them, subtle as a change in wind direction, easily ignored if you were not paying attention. She paid attention. The weeks that followed were full of the texture of working life in the summer heat of South Texas. Edna rose early and worked steadily, and Harvey rose earlier and worked harder, and they shared the table 3 times a day and slowly, like ice in warm water, the silence between them lost its formality and became something else. He began to tell her things over dinner. Small things at first, that the north fence had given way and Cleet and Darnell had spent the day repairing it, that 2 of the cows had calved early, that there was talk in town of a new rail spur coming through by spring that would change the cattle drives entirely. Then larger things. That he had wanted to be a schoolteacher when he was young, before his father's health declined, and the ranch became his responsibility. That his mother wrote him letters full of cheerful news from San Antonio that he suspected she composed to hide her worry about him. That he had once, at 17, tried to read Don Quixote and found it the most peculiar and wonderful book he had ever encountered. Edna told him things in return, about Hannibal and the river and her mother's long illness, about the small acts of independence that had sustained her learning to manage money, learning to negotiate at the market, teaching herself to read French from a water-damaged dictionary she had found at an estate sale because she had thought, at 15, that knowing French would open some door she could not yet name. She did not tell him about William Baxter, the man in Hannibal who had courted her for 2 years and then married someone with better family connections while still expecting Edna to be flattered by his continued attention. She did not tell him yet, but she was aware of it, the way you are aware of a healed bruise, not hurting, just present. In August, 3 things happened that began to change everything. The first was the letter from Harvey's mother. He read it at breakfast one morning and set it aside with an expression that he was clearly trying to make neutral and failing. Edna refilled his coffee and did not ask. He volunteered, eventually, that his mother had suggested, in her affectionate but direct way, that perhaps it was time Harvey thought about building a proper life, and that perhaps the presence of a capable young woman in his household was not merely a practical convenience, but an opportunity if he had the good sense to recognize it. He said this with his eyes on his coffee cup and the particular color in his face that fair-skinned men get when they are embarrassed. "Your mother sounds like a sensible woman," Edna said. Harvey looked up. "She is. She is also entirely too interested in my personal affairs. Perhaps because she loves you and worries about you living out here alone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you think living alone is as bad as all that?" Edna considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think there is a difference between solitude and loneliness," she said at last. "Solitude can be chosen and good. Loneliness is what happens when you spend enough time alone that you forget you have anything worth offering to another person." He looked at her for a long moment in a way that made the kitchen feel smaller. "That is," he said carefully, "a very precise distinction. I spent 2 years nursing my mother alone," she said. "I had time to think about it." The second thing that happened in August was that Edna met Redemption Creek properly. Harvey drove her into town on a Saturday to pick up supplies, and she walked the length of the main street with him, learning the geography of the place. The post office run by a tiny, fierce woman named Mrs. Abernathy, who seemed to know the contents of every letter she handled. The blacksmith shop where a man named Isaiah worked, who was the finest smithy in 3 counties. And also, as Harvey mentioned quietly, one of the only free black men to own his own business in this part of Texas, a fact that had earned him both respect and trouble in equal measure, and which he navigated with a dignity that Edna found deeply admirable when she met him. There was a small church, a school with 1 room and 1 teacher, the saloon that Edna declined to enter, a doctor's office above the barber shop, and a dry goods store owned by a sharp-eyed woman named Clara Finch, who took one look at Edna and Harvey walking together and smiled in a way that communicated a great deal without a single word. "I like this town," Edna told Harvey on the drive back. He looked at her sideways. "Most people find it too small." "I find it the right size," she said. "Large enough to have what you need, small enough that people matter to each other." He nodded slowly, turning that over. "I never thought of it that way, but yes, that is accurate." The third thing that happened in August was a storm. It came in off the Gulf Coast on a Tuesday afternoon with very little warning, the sky turning that particular sick greenish yellow that experienced Texans recognize with dread. Harvey came in from the field at a near run, calling to Cleet and Darnell to get the horses into the barn and secure everything they could, moving with the urgent economy of a man who knows what a Texas storm can do. Edna, who had never lived through anything more severe than a Missouri thunderstorm, looked at the sky and felt the first real fear she had experienced since arriving. Harvey came through the back door, found her standing in the kitchen looking out the window, and said, "Come away from the glass." "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. The house is solid. Come into the hallway away from the windows." She did. He stood beside her in the narrow hallway as the storm broke, and it was not like any storm Edna had experienced in her life. It was enormous and physical and almost personal in its fury, the wind hitting the house like something with intention, the rain coming sideways in great violent sheets, the thunder arriving not as rumble but as percussion, as blow, as sheer sound that seemed to compress the air around them. The oil lamp in the hallway flickered and went out. They stood in the dark. She was not, she told herself, frightened. But her hands had found his arm in the darkness without conscious decision, and he had not moved away. They stood like that for perhaps 20 minutes while the storm raged, his arm solid and still under her hands, until the worst of it passed and a pale half-light crept back under the door. When she released his arm, she stepped away quickly and said something brisk about checking on the kitchen, and he let her go and said nothing about the 20 minutes in the dark. But for the rest of that evening, he was careful around her in a way that was different from before, more careful and also somehow warmer, as though the storm had revealed something that both of them were going to need a little time to examine. September came and brought with it a cooling of the air and a ranching crisis of moderate scale. One of the bulls had broken through the east fence, and 3 other cattle had followed, and the resulting scramble to recover them before they reached the Alcott land to the east occupied Harvey and both Hobbs' brothers for 3 full days. Edna managed the house, kept meals ready, and on the second evening walked the half-mile to the bunkhouse to bring Cleet and Darnell coffee and corn bread, because it seemed like the human thing to do. Darnell Hobb, who was 20 and had opinions, accepted the corn bread and said with the directness of someone who had not yet learned discretion, "Miss Collins, I got to tell you, this is the best the boss has looked in the 3 years I've been working this ranch. Just so you know." Edna raised an eyebrow. Darnell's older brother Cleet, who was 23 and had more sense, elbowed him and said, "What my brother means is we appreciate the cooking, ma'am." "I understood what he meant," Edna said, and walked back to the house, but she thought about it. She thought about it in the way you think about something that you have been circling for weeks without quite letting yourself face it. The fact that the house felt different now than it had in July, and the dinners felt different, and the mornings felt different, and Harvey Carson had begun, in the quiet way of a man who is not accustomed to reaching for things, to reach for something. He brought her wildflowers once, just a handful of the small yellow things that grew at the edge of the creek, offered without explanation or fanfare, set on the kitchen table with his hat in his hands. He asked about her French one evening, and she had fetched the dictionary and shown him some words, and they had spent an impractical and very enjoyable hour trying to pronounce French verb conjugations across the kitchen table, while the dog watched them with incomprehension. He had started leaving the parlor lamp burning later in the evenings, and she had started sitting in the parlor after dinner rather than retreating to her room, and they had fallen into a habit of reading in companionable near silence that felt, when she was honest with herself, like the most natural thing in the world. She was in love with him. She recognized it the way you recognize a piece of music you have heard before, not with surprise, but with the feeling of something falling into its correct place. She had not planned for it. She had been very explicitly not planning for it. But there it was, settled in her chest with the comfortable permanence of something that has decided to stay. The question was what to do about it. Harvey Carson, for his part, was engaged in one of the more extended internal arguments of his adult life. He was not a man who made fast decisions about important things. He had thought about every significant choice he had made, the investments in the herd, the hiring of the Hobb brothers, the advertisement for a housekeeper, with the same slow, deliberate care, turning each possibility over until he was certain of it. This was different. This was not something he could think his way through, and it frightened him in the particular way that good things frightened men who had learned to expect mostly difficulty. He was aware, with the full clarity of a man who had spent a lot of time alone with his own thoughts, that Edna Collins was exceptional. Not in the way of women who are called exceptional because they are decorative or entertaining, but in the way of a person whose quality runs all the way through, who is honest without cruelty and capable without arrogance and warm without being careless with that warmth. He was aware that she made his house feel like a home in a way it had not in 7 years. He was aware that he had started finding reasons to come back to the house during the day, which he had never done before, and that the hours between dinner and sleep had become the part of his day he looked forward to most. He was also aware, with the anxious conscientiousness of a man who genuinely respected women, that she was his employee and that the power that implied was something he had to be careful with. He did not want her to feel obligated. He did not want to mistake gratitude for affection. He did not want to presume. He was still thinking about all of this, still being careful and deliberate in the way that was both his best quality and his most frustrating one, when the situation clarified itself for him in early October in the form of a man named Robert Aldous. Aldous rode into town from the east, trailing a reputation that arrived slightly ahead of him. He was a land speculator of the sort that the post-Reconstruction Texas frontier had produced in abundance, technically legal in his operations, but operating right at the edge of legality in the way of men who have sharp lawyers and sharp instincts. He was looking to buy up land around Redemption Creek ahead of the expected railroad spur, and he was the kind of man who was charming in the particular way that announces itself too loudly, handsome in a way that he was obviously aware of, with a suit that was too good for the territory and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He made inquiries at the general store, at the saloon, at the post office where Mrs. Abernathy deflected his questions with the practiced skill of a woman who has sent away a great many unwanted salesmen. He visited the Carson ranch on a Wednesday morning while Harvey was out with the cattle, and Edna answered the door. She placed him inside of 30 seconds. Men like Robert Aldous had come through Hannibal regularly, the type who wore their charm like a working tool, deploying it with practiced efficiency on whoever stood between them and what they wanted. He was polite, well-spoken, and interested in the ranch with a specificity that told her he had already done his research. He asked to speak with Mr. Carson. She told him Mr. Carson was out and offered to take his card. He offered to wait. She said that would not be convenient. He looked at her with mild surprise as though he was not accustomed to being declined gracefully, then smiled and said he would call again. When Harvey returned for lunch, she told him about the visitor. Something changed in Harvey's face when she described Aldous, not anger exactly, but a focused attention. He asked her questions. What had he said exactly? What had been his manner? Had he made any specific mention of parcels or prices? He listened to her answers with the same careful attention he gave everything. "I know who he is," Harvey said finally. "He's bought out 3 ranchers over near Crockett. Paid fair prices to 2 of them. The third one didn't want to sell and found himself with a broken fence and missing cattle until it became easier to sell than to fight." Edna was quiet for a moment. "He'll come back." "Yes." Harvey turned his coffee cup in his hands. "This land has been in my family since my father broke it. I am not selling it, to Aldous or anyone else." "Good," Edna said. She said it with a firmness that made Harvey look up. "Because this is a good place," she continued, "and it would be a shame to see it broken up and sold by someone who only sees what it could be worth." He held her gaze for a moment. "You like it here," he said, as though the certainty of it had only just landed. "I like it here very much," she said honestly. Something moved through his expression, something cautious and warm and uncertain, and then Sargent barked at something outside and the moment passed into motion. Aldous came back on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, this time while Harvey was present, and the 2 men spoke in the yard for 20 minutes in the particular tense politeness of men who understand each other completely and are not going to agree. Edna watched from the kitchen window without apology. Aldous was persuasive, reasonable, offering a price that was genuinely fair and framing the railroad development in terms of opportunity rather than threat. Harvey listened to all of it with his arms crossed, and his face settled into the patient impassivity he used when he had already made up his mind and was simply being courteous about saying so. When Aldous finally left, Harvey came inside and sat at the kitchen table, and Edna put coffee in front of him and sat across from him. "He'll make trouble," Harvey said, Probably, she agreed. I can handle it. I know you can, she paused, but you do not have to handle it alone. He looked at her for a long time. Outside, Sergeant was still barking. The October light came through the kitchen window at a low angle, catching the dust motes in the air, laying gold across the table between them. Harvey put both hands flat on the table. "Miss Collins," he said, and stopped. Edna waited. "I have been," he said, choosing each word with what was clearly considerable effort, "thinking about something for some time now. I am not a man who says things impulsively, and I do not want to say this wrong. I want to be fair to you. You came here as my employee, and I would not have you feel any obligation that is not freely chosen." "Harvey," she said, and the use of his given name for the first time made him stop. "I have been waiting for you to get to this for about 6 weeks. He stared at her. "I am not a woman who waits for much," she said, "but I thought you needed the time, so I gave it to you. I am giving you permission now to say the thing you are trying to say." There was a silence that stretched for about 5 seconds in which Harvey Carson appeared to be experiencing something close to pure astonishment. Then the corner of his mouth lifted and the gray-green of his eyes was warm, and he said, "I want to court you properly, Edna, if you're willing." "I am," she said. "I have been willing. I was beginning to think you would make me wait until spring." He laughed, the same sudden genuine laugh she had first heard on that early evening over the dried apple pie, and this time it lasted longer, and there was nothing self-conscious in it at all. The courtship of Harvey Carson and Edna Collins was conducted in the manner of two adults who are not in any doubt about what they want, but are taking a principled pleasure in arriving at it properly. He asked her to accompany him to the harvest social at the Redemption Creek Church Hall in late October, and she said yes. He drove her in the buckboard with the care of a man transporting something precious, which she found alternately endearing and slightly amusing. She wore the good dress she had brought from Missouri, dark green wool that she had worried was too fine for Texas, and which turned out to be exactly right. He wore his good coat, and had clearly troubled himself about his appearance in a way that the everyday Harvey did not, and she noticed this and valued it. The social was the kind of community event that small frontier towns do well, loud and warm, and full of children underfoot and women trading recipes, and men arguing companionably about cattle prices and local politics. Edna was introduced to a great many people in rapid succession. The Reverend and Mrs. Cross, who were young and enthusiastic, Dr. Beaumont, who had a beard like a hedge and the eyes of a man who has seen a great deal of illness and retained his compassion regardless, the Finch family, several ranching families whose names she sorted carefully into her reliable memory. Clara Finch, who ran the dry goods store, took her arm within 15 minutes and said with great directness, "I am so pleased he is here with someone. That man has been eating his heart out alone on that ranch for years, and he is too good to waste." "He is," Edna agreed. "He was sweet on a girl here 5 or 6 years ago," Clara said, lowering her voice with the comfortable authority of a woman who serves as the town's institutional memory. "Ellen Beaumont, the doctor's niece. She went east for school and married someone back there. He never said a word about it to anyone. He is terrible at saying what he feels." "He is getting better," Edna said. Harvey appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of apple cider, and Clara Finch dissolved into the crowd with the satisfied expression of someone whose intelligence had just been confirmed. They danced, eventually, when the evening progressed, and the fiddler from down near the creek arrived. Harvey danced in the careful way of a man who has not done it in a while and is concentrating on not embarrassing himself. And Edna danced as her mother had taught her lightly, and she talked to him throughout to give him something to focus on besides his feet. And by the second dance, he had relaxed into it and was actually graceful, which she suspected he would be if he stopped thinking about it so hard. On the drive home under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost excessive, they sat close on the buckboard seat, close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved away. He talked about the ranch and what he hoped to do in the next few years, another 20 head, maybe a second field of grain, repairs to the barn roof before winter. She listened and asked questions and told him about her own ideas, small ones, practical ones. A kitchen garden expanded, a henhouse better organized, a window in the hallway that she thought would change the light in the house in the mornings. And somewhere in the middle of the drive, while discussing windows of all things, his hand had found hers where it rested on her lap and held it, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the horses walked home, and the night was enormous and still, and Edna Collins felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was uncomplicated happiness. Aldous made his trouble in November, as Harvey had predicted. It was not dramatic trouble, not outlaws or burned barns or the kind of frontier violence that makes for easy stories. It was administrative trouble, which was in some ways worse. A question was raised, through Aldous' lawyer in the county seat at Henderson, about the original land grant survey of the Carson property, suggesting that the eastern boundary was incorrectly recorded and that a strip of land Harvey had been using as part of his range for 7 years had never legally been his. The claim was thin, but it was enough to create uncertainty, to slow any financial dealings Harvey might need to make, and to require a response from Harvey that would cost money and time and attention that he could not well spare. Harvey got the letter on a Thursday and read it standing in the kitchen doorway and said nothing for a long moment. Edna watched his face. "Aldous," he said. "What can be done?" she asked. "I need to get to Henderson. The land records are at the courthouse. I need to find the original survey and file a formal response." He looked up. "It will take at least 3 days, probably 4. "Then go," she said simply. "The ranch will be here. Cleet and Darnell are capable. Go and fight for it." He looked at her with an expression that she had learned was his version of profound gratitude, which looked to the uninitiated like simple steadiness. "I don't like leaving you here with Aldous circling. I have Sergeant," she said, "and I am not easily managed, as you may have noticed." He almost smiled. "I have noticed." He left on Friday morning and was back late Monday night, dusty from the road and tired in the way of a man who has done hard purposeful work. He came into the kitchen where she had kept supper warm and sat down and ate with purpose, and when he had eaten, he told her what he had found. The original survey had been done in 1861 by a surveyor named Aldous Crane, whose records were on file at the Henderson courthouse in a box that had clearly not been opened in years. The boundary in question was correctly recorded. The eastern line ran exactly where Harvey had always known it to run, along the dry wash that was visible and unmistakable. Aldous' lawyer had based the challenge on a later secondary survey done in 1869, apparently by a surveyor with connections to Aldous' land interests, which contained a discrepancy that a careful comparison with the original made clearly erroneous. The county clerk had been initially noncommittal, but Harvey had spent 2 days being methodical and courteous, and not leaving until the matter was documented properly, and he had come home with a signed letter from the clerk confirming the original survey as the legal record. "It is done," he said, and there was a quiet satisfaction in it. "And Aldous, we'll move on to easier prey." Harvey's voice was even, but there was something underneath it, not cruelty, but a settled conviction. Men like that only press where they think the resistance will break. He has found it will not. Edna reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly. He turned his hand and held hers. "Thank you," he said. "For what? I didn't go to Henderson." "You told me to go, as though it was simple." He looked at her. "Things seem simpler when you are here." Outside, November wind moved around the house, and the lamp threw steady gold across the table, and Harvey Carson held Edna's hand in his and did not let go, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was nothing that needed to be said. He asked her to marry him in December, 2 days before Christmas, and he did it with the full, deliberate gravity that such a thing deserved. He had thought about it for days, considering how to do it properly, and what he landed on was this. He came in from the morning work and cleaned up and put on his good shirt, which she noticed, And then he came into the kitchen where she was making bread and stood for a moment in the doorway. "Edna," he said, "I'd like to ask you something." She set down the bread and turned to face him, flour on her hands, flour on her apron, hair coming loose from its pins in the way it did when she had been working hard. And she looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and he thought, with the clarity that comes only occasionally, that she was the most genuinely beautiful thing he had ever seen. He said, "I know I am not a man who speaks easily. I know I am better with work than with words, and I know that a woman like you deserves both. I have tried to be better at the words since you came here, and I think maybe I have gotten a little better at it. But what I need you to know is that the ranch and the land and the work and the whole business of this life, it means something different now. It means something better because you are here, and I would like you to stay, not as my housekeeper, as my wife." He paused and then said with a plainness that was more moving than any elaborate speech could have been, "I love you, Edna. That is what I am trying to say." The kitchen was very quiet. The bread dough sat on the table. The December sun came through the window and lay across the flour-dusted boards. Edna looked at Harvey Carson standing in his good shirt with his hat in his hands, turning it once, twice, and she felt the truth of the whole preceding 4 months settle into certainty. "Yes," she said. "Harvey, yes." He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and she was still covered in flour, and he did not care at all. And he held her with the restrained tenderness of a man who is trying very hard not to hold someone as tightly as he actually wants to. And she put her floury hands against his good shirt and held him back. And he said into her hair, "I am going to ruin this shirt." And she laughed into his shoulder. They were married in the Redemption Creek Church on the 14th of February, 1879, which was Valentine's Day, which Edna had not planned but which the town found tremendously satisfying. The Reverend Cross performed the ceremony with evident delight. Clara Finch cried openly and made no apologies for it. Cleet and Darnell Hobb wore their best clothes and stood in the front pew looking proud of themselves, as though they had somehow arranged the whole thing. Dr. Beaumont gave a toast at the reception in the church hall that was so long and rambling and heartfelt that 3 people were simultaneously moved to tears and suppressing laughter. Isaiah the blacksmith, who had become one of Harvey's most trusted acquaintances in the town, showed up with his wife and 3 children, and a wedding gift of 2 perfectly made iron hooks for the kitchen that were both practical and beautiful, which Edna said were the best wedding gift she received, which she meant. Harvey's mother, Edna Collins, made the journey up from San Antonio, arriving 2 days before the wedding with enough energy for a woman 20 years her junior, and an immediate warm approval of Edna that she expressed by taking Edna's hands in hers within 5 minutes of arrival and saying, "I wrote to him about you. Did he tell you that? I told him not to be a fool." "He was not a fool," Edna said, "only thorough." Edna Collins laughed and looked at her son with the eyes of a woman whose long worry has finally resolved itself into relief, and Harvey, standing nearby, shook his head at both of them with the expression of a man who has accepted his fate. The first year of their marriage had the quality of all first years, the adjustment and negotiation of 2 whole people learning to share a space fully, which had its frictions and its revelations, and its unexpected gifts. The frictions were minor and practical. Harvey had habits of solitude so ingrained that he occasionally needed reminding that silence was not always preferable to conversation. Edna had a directness that sometimes arrived with more force than she intended, a habit she was aware of and working on. They were both stubborn, though they expressed it differently. He was slow and immovable. She was quick and persistent. These qualities were sometimes in conflict and more often when they were pointed in the same direction, extremely effective as a team. The revelations were better. She learned that he had a genuine and mostly hidden sense of humor that emerged sideways, in small, dry observations delivered at unexpected moments, and that this was one of her favorite things about him. He learned that she read voraciously and had opinions about books that were as precisely reasoned as her opinions about everything else, and that she would defend those opinions at length with both logic and passion, and that this was something he found, to his own mild surprise, completely captivating. They read to each other in the evenings when the work was done, which became a ritual neither of them would have willingly given up. The unexpected gifts were the texture of shared days, the way he always refilled her coffee before she asked, having learned her rhythms without conscious effort, the way she knew by the set of his shoulders when he came in from the range whether the day had been good or difficult, the way they moved around the kitchen together without collision, having established without discussion the particular choreography of two people who have stopped being careful around each other. In the spring of 1880, Edna told Harvey she was going to have a child. She told him simply in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, watching his face. His face went through several things quickly, the initial surprised blink, then something flooding through the gray-green of his eyes that was too large to name, then a deliberate steadiness as he came to her and put his hands gently on her shoulders. "Are you well?" he asked. The first question. She had expected something else. "I am very well," she told him. "Dr. Beaumont says everything is right." He exhaled, and what came out with that breath was weeks of unspoken concern she had not known he was carrying. Then he drew her into his arms with such careful gentleness that she pressed her face against his chest and laughed, and told him she was pregnant, not made of glass, and he laughed too, but did not loosen his hold. He became, during the pregnancy, simultaneously more efficient and more attentive, which was a combination of qualities she had not thought possible. The ranch work continued at its necessary pace. He was not a man to let essential things slide. But he found ways to be present that he had not found before, coming in at midday not just for dinner but to see her, asking with genuine interest about how she was feeling in a way that was not anxious but caring, taking on without comment the heavier work that she had previously done herself. She did not let him take on too much. She continued to manage the house and the kitchen and the garden, firmly and with the stubbornness that was deeply constitutive of her character, until the final weeks when she made certain practical concessions to what her body required. Their son was born in November of 1880, in a difficult labor that Dr. Beaumont attended, that lasted longer than was comfortable and ended well. Harvey, who had spent the hours of it in the room outside the bedroom door with the rigid stillness of a man who is holding himself under control by the most determined effort, came in when Dr. Beaumont opened the door and stood at the bedside looking at the red-faced, furious small person in Edna's arms with an expression that Edna found, even through her exhaustion, completely undone in the best possible way. "Boy," she told him, though Beaumont had already said it. "I see that," Harvey said, and his voice was not quite steady. "Come meet him." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms with the confidence of a woman who has no doubts, and Harvey Carson held his son for the first time with the extreme careful precision of a man handling something he does not yet trust himself with. And then the baby opened its unfocused eyes, and Harvey looked down at it, and everything in his face went completely quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something important is being understood. They named him James, after Harvey's father. James Carson grew with the excellent stubbornness of a child who has inherited the best qualities of two determined people. He walked early, talked insistently, and was devoted to the dog Sergeant with an intensity that Sergeant bore with old dog patience. By the time James was 2, he was following his father around the ranch with the absorbed attention of an apprentice. And Harvey, who had not expected to have a particular talent for fatherhood, discovered that he was utterly enchanted by his son, and had apparently been so from the first moment. Edna watched her husband with their child and felt a happiness that was different from any other kind she had experienced. Not the sharp happiness of the early days of love, not the satisfied happiness of work done well, but something deeper and more sustaining, a happiness that felt like certainty. In the summer of 1882, two things happened that completed the architecture of their life. The first was that the railroad came through, as everyone had predicted, though it came through the south side of Redemption Creek rather than the east, which disappointed some speculators and pleased the established ranchers, because it meant the town grew rather than being transformed beyond recognition. Harvey negotiated a cattle contract with the rail depot that tripled his effective market range, and the herd grew to nearly 400 head. He hired 2 more hands, built a new section of fence, and made the repairs to the barn roof that had been on his list since before Edna arrived. The second was that Aldous appeared one final time. He did not ride in with lawyers or challenges. He came quietly, alone, and found Harvey at the water trough one afternoon, and said that he was moving his operations to New Mexico territory and wanted to make a straight offer for the Carson land as a final attempt. He named a price that was extraordinary more than fair, the kind of price that in different circumstances would have been the answer to a man's problems. Harvey listened to all of it with his arms folded, then said, "No." Aldous looked at him for a moment. "You understand what I'm offering?" "I understand completely," Harvey said. "This land is not for sale. It is where my family lives. I would not sell it for twice that price." There was a pause in which Aldous appeared to genuinely process this as a concept he had encountered rarely in his career. Then he nodded once and said, "Your father broke good land." It might have been the most honest thing he had ever said. He rode away and was not seen in Redemption Creek again. That evening Harvey told Edna about it while James slept and the summer dark settled over the ranch. They sat on the porch, which Harvey had built properly the previous spring with a good rail and 2 chairs that suited long evening sitting, and the stars were out in force over the flat Texas country, and the cattle moved somewhere in the dark with their quiet sounds. "He's gone," Harvey said. "Good," Edna said. "He offered a price that was genuinely remarkable. I know you said no." Without hesitation, he was quiet for a moment. "This is our home." She reached over and took his hand the way she often did in the evenings, easily and without ceremony, and he turned his palm to hers. "Yes," she said, "it is." The years that followed were full and real and ordinary in all the ways that matter, the kind of ordinary that is not smallness but is the daily substance of a life well chosen. The ranch grew and steadied. James grew from a toddler to a boy with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's precise way of making an argument. Clete Hobb married a woman named Rosa in 1883, and they built a small house on the edge of the Carson land with Harvey's blessing. And Darnell, who had eventually grown into the good sense that his brother had always had, went to work at Isaiah's smithy and showed a natural talent for metalwork that surprised everyone except Isaiah himself. Clara Finch's dry goods store became the closest thing Redemption Creek had to a social institution, and Edna's friendship with Clara deepened over the years into the kind of friendship between women that is a great sustaining force, built on honesty and mutual respect, and the shared ability to say difficult things without cruelty. They met every Thursday when Edna came into town and talked about everything: the town, their lives, the books Edna sent away for, the state of things in the larger world. Clara never married and did not appear to wish she had, though she was fond of children and was an unofficial godmother to James and to the child who came later. That child was a girl, born in the autumn of 1884, with Harvey's coloring and Edna's manner, and a disposition of such serene certainty that Dr. Beaumont declared her the most confident infant he had ever delivered. They named her Margaret for Edna's mother and called her Maggie, and the name suited her completely. Harvey's mother came for Maggie's birth as she had come for James's, and she stayed longer this time, 3 weeks, during which she and Edna fell into an easy partnership in the running of the household that was marked by mutual affection and occasional spirited disagreement about the correct method of making biscuits, which Harvey stayed entirely out of, and which resolved itself eventually in a compromise position satisfying to both parties. James, who was 4 when Maggie was born, greeted his sister with the solemn gravity of a small person taking on an important responsibility, and then proceeded to take that responsibility extraordinarily seriously, appointing himself her primary guardian and protector from her first week, which Maggie tolerated with the equanimity that was apparently her native characteristic. Harvey's mother returned to San Antonio with the evident contentment of a woman who has seen her greatest concern, resolved beyond her best expectation, and she wrote more cheerful letters after that, letters that Edna read with real affection, and Harvey read with the fond exasperation of a son who loves his mother. One evening in the winter of 1885, when James was 4 and Maggie was newly 1, and the house was quiet after bedtime, Harvey and Edna sat by the fire in the parlor with the books that were their particular evening pleasure. The fire was good, and the wind outside was working at the eaves, and the lamp threw its steady light. Harvey was reading. Edna looked at him for a moment over the top of her own book, at the face she knew as well as her own now, the gray-green eyes moving along the page, the lines that the years and the sun had put there, the way his mouth held the particular stillness of a man who is fully content. She thought about the platform in Redemption Creek in July of 1878, the dust and the heat, and the way she had stepped off that stagecoach into an unknown life with a trunk and a bag and the determination to begin something new. She thought about the journey that had led from that moment to this one, with all its texture and complication and surprise, and the truth of it was that she would not have changed a single morning. Harvey looked up, catching her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" she considered. "About being exactly where I should be," she said. He held her gaze for a moment with those quiet eyes that she had once thought she could not read and had long since learned were, when you knew them, entirely transparent. He put his book down. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand. "Yes," he said simply, and that was enough, and it was everything. The seasons turned over the Carson ranch with the rhythm of a life properly built. Spring brought the calving and the planting and the particular Texas wildflowers that Harvey still, after all these years, occasionally picked and left on the kitchen table without explanation and without expecting comment. Summer brought heat and work and the long evenings on the porch. Fall brought the harvest and the social at the church hall, which they attended every year, and where Harvey now danced without thinking about his feet. Winter brought the slow time that was for reading and mending, and the close warmth of a house that was a home. James started school in 1886 at the one-room school in Redemption Creek, where the teacher, a young woman from Illinois named Miss Percy, told Edna at the end of the first month that her son was the most frightening reader she had encountered in 6 years of teaching, in the best possible way. James took to learning the way he took to most things, with thoroughness, focus, and the particular Carson quality of patience in the face of difficulty. He was also, his mother noted with private amusement, quietly kind to the other children in the precise unconscious way of a person who has simply been raised with decency as an expectation rather than an aspiration. Maggie, who began her life as the most tranquil of infants, revealed as she grew into toddlerhood a personality of quite extraordinary will, which her father navigated with tender, careful humor, and her mother recognized with the knowing eye of a woman who has similar tendencies. Maggie had opinions on everything from the order of meals to the correct arrangement of the front porch, and conveyed them with a clarity that was, everyone agreed, somewhat astonishing in a child of 2. Harvey said once, watching his daughter explain to the dog why she had decided his sleeping spot was relocating to the kitchen, that Maggie had inherited her mother's gift for direct communication. "Is that a complaint?" Edna asked. "It is my deepest compliment," he said. The town of Redemption Creek grew with the steady, modest growth of frontier towns that had good bones, the addition of a second church, a small school extension, a doctor's new office properly on the ground floor when Dr. Beaumont's knees made the stairs over the barber shop unreasonable, a telegraph office that connected them to the larger world with a quickness that still seemed remarkable to those who remembered riding 3 days for news. Isaiah expanded his smithy and took on an apprentice, a young man of 16 who had arrived in town with nothing and turned out to have extraordinary aptitude for the work. Harvey gave Isaiah a fair price on the ironwork for the new barn section, and they had dinner together at the Carson table 3 or 4 times a year, the kind of friendship that is built quietly on mutual respect and does not need much ceremony. In 1888, Harvey and Edna made their one great journey, leaving the ranch in Cleet's capable hands and taking the train. James was 8 and found the train the most magnificent thing in the world. Maggie was 3 and found it appropriately interesting down to San Antonio to visit Edna Carson, who had written several times in the preceding year that her health was not poor, but that she would very much like to see her grandchildren before they got any older without her. San Antonio in 1888 was a different kind of Texas from Redemption Creek, old and layered, with the Mexican and Spanish and American histories stacked on top of each other in the streets, and the architecture, and the food, and the faces of the people who lived there. Edna, who had arrived in Texas from Missouri and built her Texas life on the flat ranch country, found San Antonio extraordinary. She walked its streets with the open, curious attention she gave to everything new, taking in the old missions and the market plazas, and the acequia running through the center of things, asking questions and noting what she saw. Edna Carson was smaller than Edna had remembered from the wedding, the years having gently reduced her, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, and she held Maggie in her lap and told James stories about his grandfather with the pleasure of a woman who has been waiting years to tell them to the right audience. Harvey watched his mother with his children and was quieter than usual, and Edna knew, in the way she knew most things about him, that he was holding something careful and glad and a little sorrowful about the passing of time. One afternoon, sitting in Edna's small courtyard with the San Antonio sun warm and golden and the sound of the city murmuring beyond the walls, Edna took Edna's hand and said, "I want to tell you what it has meant having you with him. He is a good man and he was so alone, and now he is not." "He is not alone," Edna agreed. "Happy," Edna said with the precision of a woman who means the specific word she uses. "Not just not alone, happy. He is genuinely happy. I see it in everything about him." She squeezed Edna's hand. "Thank you." Edna thought of the advertisement in the Missouri Weekly Gazette, and the trunk and the bag, and the dust rising off Redemption Creek, and the moment she had first shaken Harvey Carson's hand on that summer platform and felt the solidity of him, and she said, "It has been as much for me as for him." Edna looked at her with warm eyes. "I know," she said. "I can see that too." They returned to the ranch after 2 weeks, and the ranch received them with the comfortable permanence of a place that knows itself. Harvey walked the fence line the first morning back, habit and love of the land equally expressed in the gesture, and Edna stood on the porch watching him go and felt the rightness of their particular life settle over her like good light. The winter of 1889 was a hard one, the hardest in a decade, with a cold that came down from the north in January and did not let go for 6 weeks. Harvey and Cleet worked to keep the cattle from dangerous cold, and Edna kept the house burning and the meals substantial and the children warm, and the whole ranch enterprise faced one of those hard seasons that the land periodically requires as evidence of commitment. They lost 4 head to the cold and a section of the south fence to ice damage, and Harvey took both losses with the equanimity of a man who has learned that the land does not owe you its good favor, and that the only reasonable response to difficulty is methodical repair. By March the cold had broken and the pastures were greening and the calves were coming and the repair work was done, and Harvey came in on a March evening with mud on his boots and the look of a man who has finished a hard season and is standing in his own kitchen with his wife and his children and is entirely at peace with his life. "Spring," he said, hanging his hat. "Spring," Edna confirmed. James appeared from the direction of the parlor with a book under his arm, having reached the age of 9 at which books and the outdoors competed equally for his attention, depending on the specific quality of each. "Maggie took Sergeant's bone again," James reported. "He is very sad about it." "Tell your sister to give it back," Edna said. "I already told her. She says she's keeping it." Harvey looked at Edna. Edna looked at Harvey. "Maggie," Harvey said, in the particular carrying tone that 4-year-olds respond to, "please return the bone." A small voice from the kitchen said, "It was in the wrong place. The bone belongs to Sergeant." "Sergeant does not have a system," Maggie announced. Harvey put his hand over his mouth. Edna did not bother hiding her amusement. This was their household, with its small, fierce arguments and its large, settled love, with the dog who had survived from Harvey's solitary years into the middle of a family, with the children who were distinct whole people bearing the clear marks of their parents' best qualities. "She has a point about the system," Harvey said quietly to Edna. "Do not encourage her," Edna said, equally quietly. The next several years built on themselves in the way that good years do, each one adding its particular substance to the whole. The herd reached 500 head. Harvey hired a third permanent hand, a quiet, capable man named Everett who had come down from Kansas and knew cattle as well as anyone Harvey had worked with. The house gained a proper library, which was Edna's project and Harvey's great enthusiasm, a room off the parlor with shelves that Harvey built, and that they filled over years from orders to the bookseller in Houston and the occasional lucky find at the Henderson market. James grew into a young man of quiet intelligence and genuine goodness, finishing the Redemption Creek School at the top of whatever that meant in a one-room classroom, and then proceeding, with his mother's assistance in the correspondence, to arrange his way into the academy at Austin for further education. He left in the autumn of 1893 at the age of 13, which was at the outer edge of the appropriate age for such departures. And the morning he got on the southbound stage, Edna stood on the Redemption Creek Main Street and maintained her composure by the sheer force of a will that she had been exercising for 39 years. Harvey, standing beside her, said nothing, but his hand found hers and held on. "He'll be fine," she said. "Of course he will," Harvey agreed. They stood there until the stage was out of sight, and then they drove back to the ranch in the comfortable silence that was one of the great inheritances of their years together. Maggie, who was 8 when James left, took his absence as an opportunity to occupy a slightly larger portion of the family's attention, which she had always felt was her correct share in any case. She had her father's patience and her mother's precision and a creative stubbornness that appeared to be an evolutionary advancement on both, and she read everything in the new library with a thoroughness that delighted Edna and occasionally alarmed the more conservative members of the Redemption Creek community, who felt that certain books were not obviously appropriate for a 9-year-old girl. Edna's position on this was clear and not available for debate. Harvey watched his daughter grow with the same enchantment he had felt since she was born, and there was something between them, the quiet man and his fierce small daughter, that was its own particular kind of love, different from anything else in the family's constellation. In the spring of 1895, James wrote from Austin to say that his professor of law had suggested he had the aptitude and the commitment for a proper legal education, and that there was a program in Austin that would take him, and that he wanted his parents' thoughts on the matter. Harvey read the letter at breakfast and passed it to Edna. Edna read it and set it down and looked at her husband. "Well," she said. "He has always been able to argue," Harvey said. "He has always been able to argue correctly," Edna corrected. "Which is something different," Harvey nodded slowly. "He should do it." "Yes," Edna said. She wrote back that afternoon to tell James that they were proud and that he should pursue what he was capable of and that the ranch would be here and his room would be here whenever he came home. James wrote back, "I know it will be. That is what makes it possible to go." Edna put that letter in the small wooden box where she kept the things that mattered. Maggie went to school in Redemption Creek with the same dedication James had shown, and when the one-room school could not challenge her further, Edna taught her herself. The French from the old water-damaged dictionary that had made its way from Missouri to Texas and held its place on the library shelf through all the years. Mathematics from Harvey's account books, which were meticulous. Literature from everything on the library shelves. And history from the world itself, which Edna believed was always the best teacher. On their 20th wedding anniversary, in February of 1899, Harvey arranged something he had been planning in secret for 3 weeks, which was an enormous feat of will for a man constitutionally unable to keep information from his wife. He had written to James in Austin, who was by then 20 and in the final year of his legal training, and came home with the suppressed excitement of someone keeping a secret. He had coordinated with Clara Finch, who had kept the secret with a discipline she applied to very few things. He had arranged, in short, for everyone who had mattered to their life in Redemption Creek to come to the Carson Ranch on the evening of the 14th of February under the pretext of a simple dinner. The result was the most complete gathering their house had ever held. The Finches and the Hobbs and Everett and Isaiah and his family and the Reverend Cross and Dr. Beaumont, who was 58 and had delivered both their children and had no intention of missing this, and Harvey's mother, who was 72 and had made the journey from San Antonio on the train with James, who had escorted her, and who arrived at the ranch in the February afternoon looking exactly as imperious and delighted as she always had. Maggie, who was 14 and had been in on the secret for a week, found keeping it almost more than she could manage, and could not have been more pleased with herself for managing it. Edna, walking into her own kitchen that afternoon to find her entire life assembled in her house, stood for a moment in the doorway and experienced the rare, complete stillness of absolute happiness. The moment when everything you have built and everyone you love is in the same room, and the years behind you look exactly right, and the years ahead still stretch with possibility. Harvey came to stand beside her in the doorway. He was 51 now, and the years were in him honestly, the lines at his eyes and the silver in his hair, and the way he moved with the deliberate ease of a man who has spent 30 years of physical work and has made peace with every ounce of it. He was still the same man she had shaken hands with on a dusty July platform more than 20 years ago, only fuller, only more completely himself. "I wanted to do something proper," he said. "This is," she told him, "perfectly proper." He took her hand. "20 years," he said. "And then some," she said. "The first months count." He looked at her with those still gray-green eyes and said, quietly, so that only she could hear it under the sounds of the people who made up their world, "I would do it again from the first morning, every bit of it." She looked back at him and said, "So would I. From the moment I stepped off that stage and you held your hat in your hands and looked at me like you'd ordered something from a catalog and weren't sure it had been a good idea." He laughed. The same sudden genuine laugh from 22 years ago, unchanged. "I knew within a week," he said. "A week," she said. "It took you a week." "To be certain," he said. "I was already inclined after the first dinner." "The dried apple pie," she said. "The dried apple pie," he agreed. James appeared from the direction of the parlor to say that grandmother was asking for them, and they went in together to their gathered life. The party lasted until past midnight, which was remarkable for Redemption Creek on a February weeknight, and would be talked about for years afterward. There was food in quantities that tested the capacity of the kitchen and the dining table combined. There were speeches, Dr. Beaumont's being longest and most tangential as tradition required. There was music. Someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had a harmonica, and the furniture in the parlor was pushed back, and there was dancing, including Harvey dancing with Edna in the cleared space of their own parlor in front of everyone who loved them. And he danced as well as he had ever danced, which was to say without thinking about it at all. James watched his parents dance and leaned against the wall beside his grandmother, who was sitting with a glass of warm cider and an expression of complete satisfaction. "They are good together," James said. "They are essential to each other," his grandmother corrected, with the precision that ran in the family. "Which is better?" James considered this. "Yes," he said, "that's the right word for it." When the last guests had gone and the children were asleep, Maggie had lasted impressively late on the strength of stubbornness, before finally being overruled by necessity. And the house was quiet in the way it went quiet after fullness. Harvey and Edna sat on the porch in the cold February night, wrapped in the heavy quilt that lived in the parlor for exactly such occasions. The stars were out. They always were out here in this particular expanse of Texas night. "Thank you," Edna said. "For what?" "For all of it." She leaned into his shoulder. "For the advertisement in the Missouri Gazette. For coming to meet the stage, for being exactly as you are." His arm came around her and he held her in the warmth of the quilt against the cold. "The advertisement was practical," he said. "Everything with you starts practical," she said. "That is not a criticism." "I know." He pressed his lips to her temple briefly in the easy way of 20 years. "I wrote it 7 times before I put it in the paper. I wasn't sure what to say." "You said capable woman sought for housekeeper position, serious inquiries only. It was not an overwhelming advertisement." "Apparently it was overwhelming enough." She laughed softly. "Apparently." They sat with the stars and the quiet and the dark rangeland running out beyond the fence, and the cattle somewhere in the dark, and the dog inside at the hearth, and the children asleep, and 20 years of their life written into every board and beam and field and fence of the place around them. "What do you think comes next?" she asked. He considered the question with his usual thoroughness. "James will come home when he finishes his training. There's a need for a good lawyer in Henderson, and he could come home and ride out. The herd could go to 600 if the spring is good. The library needs more shelves. Maggie will need more books." He paused. "And I suspect Maggie is going to keep arguing with everything until something good eventually gives in and argues back, at which point she will be very happy." Edna smiled. "She will. And we will be here," he said, "doing what we do." "Yes," she said, "we will." She turned her face up to the February stars over Texas, feeling the solid weight of his arm around her, feeling the particular peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but is the sufficiency of what you have built to meet whatever difficulty comes. And she thought that if she had known, on that July platform in 1878, what was waiting at the end of the stagecoach journey, she would have felt many things: surprise and hope, and the particular species of joy that comes from the unexpected rightness of things. But she would not have been afraid. James graduated from his legal training in the summer of 1899 and came home to Redemption Creek to practice, setting up an office in the rooms above Clara Finch's dry goods store, and establishing himself with quiet efficiency as the most rigorous and fair-minded legal mind in the county. He was 23 years old, and had his father's steady character and his mother's formidable intellect, and the combination produced, in the law, exactly what one would expect. The people of Redemption Creek took to him immediately, which was partly because he was good at what he did, and partly because he was fundamentally decent, and partly because his mother was Edna Carson, whose standing in the community after 20 years was simply bedrock. Harvey, who had spent 3 years imagining a version of the ranch's future in which his son had no interest in cattle, discovered when James came home that the young man had simply stored his inheritance quietly and was entirely willing to learn the parts he hadn't known. They worked together through that summer with the ease of 2 people who know each other down to the foundations, and Harvey passed along a great deal of knowledge about the land and the herd and the operations of the ranch, with the satisfaction of a man who has built something worth passing on. Maggie, who was 15 when James returned, and had spent 3 years as the only young Carson on the ranch, adjusted to her brother's presence by immediately arguing with him about 3 separate topics within the first week. arriving at satisfying positions on two of them, and settling into a sibling dynamic that was the most intellectually competitive relationship in Redemption Creek, and the source of considerable entertainment for everyone around them. The century turned, and the world beyond Redemption Creek was changing in ways that were large and distant and felt, from the Carson Ranch, both important and manageable. The railroad had made the world smaller. The telegraph made it smaller still. Harvey read the newspapers that came from Houston and Dallas and Austin, and discussed them with Edna in the evenings, with the thoughtful engagement of people who know that the larger world is not separate from their own. On a morning in the early spring of 1901, Harvey and Edna rode out together on the ranch, which they had been doing occasionally for years, just the two of them, on a circuit of the land that was at once practical inspection and private pleasure. The Texas spring was at its best, the live oaks putting out their pale new leaves, the creek running well from the winter rains, the wildflowers coming up in the patches of open ground. They rode without urgency, side by side where the ground allowed it, following the fence line south and then east to where the dry wash marked the boundary that Harvey had defended all those years ago. They stopped there, at the old boundary, looking out at the land that had been Harvey's father's and was Harvey's and would eventually be James's, and whatever came after James. The cattle moved in the middle distance. The sky was enormous and blue, and the morning had the particular clarity that the best spring mornings have. "Do you remember," Harvey said, "when we first rode out here together? You had been here about 3 months and I wanted to show you the property lines. You explained the east boundary for about 15 minutes, Edna said. I could tell you were proud of it. I was, he said simply. I still am. You should be. He looked at her across the space between their horses. 23 years of mornings were in his face and in his eyes and in the way he held himself in the saddle with the quiet ease of a man who is exactly where he belongs. She thought he was more himself now than he had ever been, which was the best thing she knew how to say about a person. I am glad you answered that advertisement, he said. I am glad you placed it, she said. The wind moved through the mesquite and the wildflowers bent and came back up. Sergeant, not the original sergeant, who had lived a good long dog life and gone peacefully in the winter of 1891, but his successor, a big yellow dog James had brought home from Austin, who had inherited the name, as an honor barked somewhere behind them at something requiring attention. Harvey and Edna turned their horses and rode home together through the morning, through the land they had built their life on, under the enormous unchanged Texas sky, and the spring came on around them green and certain. And behind them in the house their daughter was reading, and their son was reading something different and disagreeing with it. And everything was exactly as it should be, finished and full and good. A life built piece by piece from courage and work, and the willingness to love something fully and hold on. The distance between the east boundary and the house was perhaps 1.5 miles, a comfortable ride through good land, and they took it at an easy pace, side by side, with nothing left unsaid and nowhere else to be.